Hey Mitchell, I'm back again for another reading of Tin Soldier by Sigmund Brouwer. We left off finishing chapter 7 and we are now going to start chapter 8. 2 hours later, Allie swung the big rumbling motorcycle into a parking spot in front of a small cafe on the main street of a small town. She didn't turn off the engine. She didn't get off the motorcycle. Webb did. He set his helmet on the passenger seat of the bike. He groaned and stretched his legs, then his back. They had gone about 80 miles on the Indian Chief, every mile at the speed limit because they couldn't risk being entered into a computer for a traffic violation. As Webb completed his stretching, Allie snapped the spare helmet back into its strap. "Delivery complete," Allie said, her words nearly lost in the deep throb of the idling engine. "Good luck." "Yeah, thanks for..." Webb stopped because he was speaking to exhaust fumes. She dropped the bike into gear and roared away from the curb. She was beautiful, but obviously a pain. He told himself not to think about how her smile gave him the same boost as, say, a sunrise or a good song. Webb checked out his surroundings. The sign at the town limit had read, "Welcome to historic Marion, established 1817, the college city." She'd taken him straight downtown, past brick two-story buildings with advertisements painted directly onto the brick. He hadn't seen a college. In front of him was Mac's Cafe, with a small neon light inside the window that glowed open. So Webb thought, alone in a strange place again. Webb was accustomed to solitude. He was accustomed to taking care of himself. About a year ago, he'd been living on the streets. Still, it was unsettling to find himself in this situation. He had his travel bag with his guitar inside it, $100 cash, give or take, and a debit card for maybe $600 in savings. That was all he needed, right? He could walk away, find a sheltered bus stop to sleep in overnight, and find a way back to Nashville, where he would work on new songs. Or he could step inside the cafe and get more involved in something that had already resulted in arson and maybe attempted murder. Webb knew what he wanted to choose, a sheltered bus stop. But his grandfather, David McLean, had made it possible for Webb to get to Nashville in the first place. Webb owed a lot to his grandfather and to his memory. Webb had no choice but to try to clear his grandfather's name. What if stepping inside the cafe only confirmed the worst about David McLean? He pushed aside the troubling thought. Webb told himself to trust his grandfather, the man he believed had done nothing wrong. Webb pushed open the door to the cafe. Sitting in a booth at the back was Lee Knox. Webb slid into the booth across from Lee. "Hungry?" Lee asked. There was a leather jacket folded on the seat beside him, and he was wearing a UT t-shirt. "I'm buying. I suggest the meatloaf." Webb wasn't that hungry, but he nodded. Lee waved over the waitress, who took their order in silence. Webb ordered meatloaf. He was irritated with Lee, so it made him feel better to make the man pay for the food that Webb wasn't going to enjoy. "How was the ride?" Lee asked after the waitress left. "Lots of turns, like she was lost." "Lots of fast turns," Webb said, "like someone was chasing us." "Good," Lee said. "Roy and I are acting on the assumption that people are going to try to track us." Allie was supposed to make sure she wasn't followed. "People?" Webb asked. How crazy was this? What people? "Don't know yet," Lee said. "Need to find out." "People who can track us through, say, traffic violations." "Well, we'll get to that," Lee said, "but I have a story for you first. Nearly 50 years ago, in the kitchen right behind us, Alabama state troopers began clubbing a man on the floor. All he'd done was join some marchers who were going to stand in front of a jail and sing hymns for someone who had been arrested for helping to register black voters. State troopers busted up the march and chased people, including the man they trapped in the kitchen, Jimmy Lee Jackson, who tried to protect the man being clubbed. Webb remembered the engraving on the memorial. 26 February 1965. Jimmy Lee Jackson, Civil Rights March, killed by state trooper, Marion, Alabama. Lee stared at his coffee cup for a few moments. He lifted his left hand off the table and reached over with his thumb and forefinger to pluck and lift the loose skin on the back of his right hand. This, he said, was the color of that man's skin, same as mine, black. Some folks want to call us African American. I'm okay with that, but I prefer black. It's what I am, black. Lee looked Webb straight in the eyes. Ever had people sitting in cars at an intersection lock their doors when they notice you are on the sidewalk waiting for a light to change? Ever had store owners follow you up and down the aisle to make sure you don't steal something? Webb shook his head. When he'd been living on the streets, he'd worked hard to look groomed and clean. Otherwise, he supposed he would have faced the same thing. It's because you're white, Lee said. Let me tell you, when the stuff happens, it feels like there's acid sitting in your stomach. It sits there for a long time after, too. Lee took a breath. Almost 50 years ago, the black man in the kitchen getting clubbed by troopers. He was 82 years old. His daughter Viola tried to pull the troopers away and they began beating her too. That's when the grandson stepped in and tried to help his mother and his grandfather. Grandson's name was Jimmy Lee Jackson. A state trooper shot him twice in the belly, and they beat him with clubs as he staggered out of this cafe. Jimmy Lee Jackson died about a week later in the hospital. Nurse there said she saw powder burns on his belly. Trooper was that close when he pulled the trigger. It left powder burns. Grand jury back then didn't feel there was enough evidence for the trooper to go to trial. A few years back, he finally did get charged with first-degree murder. He pled guilty to manslaughter and only got 6 months in jail. With a slap in the face of justice. What a slap in the face of justice. I want you to give this a minute of silence, just to think about it. One part of Webb wanted to protest. The injustice wasn't his fault. But a bigger part of Webb could see it happening. The clubs coming down on an old man who had believed that singing hymns was a good way to make a statement. A man on the floor who looked up and saw troopers shoot his grandson in the belly, a grandson who had tried to protect him. Troopers, men who were supposed to protect people and uphold the law. Webb let out a deep, sad breath. Only 50 years ago. Yesterday, much as you irritated me, I knew just enough about you and the efforts you'd made to help Ruby that I thought it would be worthwhile to spend a little time getting to see things from my point of view, Lee said after the moment of silence had passed. I needed those Camaro parts for Roy Hawkins anyway, and I thought the money I spent sending you to Montgomery would be a good investment, if it taught you to look at the world through my eyes, if only for a minute or two. That's how change is made, one person at a time. Lee lifted the skin on the back of his hand again, then let it drop. Maybe you're thinking that it was a lot more time and effort than necessary to bring you right here to Marion. Jimmy Lee Jackson's death sparked a huge march, you know. It did make a difference eventually, but that's not why we are sitting here. First reason is, I needed to disappear. I'm using throwaway cell phones and cash only. This place was as good as any to meet you and stay on the run. He caught the look that Webb was unable to hide. Yeah, Lee said, I'm on the run, no doubt. Why? All I did was make a few phone calls about those identification cards. Lee tapped the side of his coffee cup as if he had too much nervous energy and didn't know what to do with it. I was 16 when all this happened here. This is my hometown. I could have been part of the hymn singing that night, but I thought it wasn't my business. I was wrong. Later I marched from Selma to Montgomery, and I faced down troopers who wanted to shoot us in the crowd. What happened that night in the cafe? It changed me. You should know that about me because it looks like we are going to be spending some time together. That's because you and I will be asking some questions in the next few days, and we won't be trusting a single one of the people we ask. You're going to be on the run with me, unless you want out. The waitress set down 2 orders of meatloaf. Webb looked across the steaming dishes at Lee. In, Webb said. Want to tell me more about what happened last night? Webb began to pick at his food, mainly just moving it around on the plate. I heard the fire alarm coming from my garage, Lee said, also leaving his food untouched. I looked out my window, and it was already in flames. I tried calling the fire department, but my landline was out. My cell phone wouldn't work either. I ran outside thinking maybe I could do something with my garden hose, but all I could do was watch the garage burn. Motorcycle and Camaro inside. When I turned around, my house was on fire. Some people might think I was lucky getting out of the house in time, but I don't. I'm guessing whoever set the garage on fire did it to get me out of the house. What they really wanted to do was burn down the house. Can you think of a reason why? Webb shook his head. A bit of meatloaf tasted like sawdust to him. He put ketchup on it. 2 identification cards, Lee said. Somebody with the ability to cut off my landline and jam my cell phone signals wanted the cards destroyed so that nobody could prove they existed. Somebody who later listened in on my call to Roy Hawkins. That was my test. First thing in the morning, I called from my cell and told Roy he could find you at the Civil Rights Memorial later in the afternoon. That gave whoever it was all day to send someone there. The fact that someone showed up told me they were monitoring my calls. 2 identification cards. They can't be worried about the names because those are easy to memorize. It must be the photographs they want destroyed, so that no one can prove one soldier had 2 cards in 2 different names. Them, Webb said. Who is them? Gangsters from BTK? Someone higher up is my guess, Lee said. Someone who could send BTK after you. Someone who found out I was asking about those cards and wanted the questions to stop. As I mentioned, someone with considerable resources. Let's just call him the boogeyman. Boogeyman? I thought that was an imaginary monster. Imaginary until we track him down. Both cards burned in the house though. That's going to make it a whole lot tougher on us. I've still got both, Webb said. Set his iPhone on the table. I saved them in the cloud. He pulled up the photos he'd taken of the identification cards. Jesse Lockwood, Benjamin Moody. 2 names, 1 face. Lee grinned. All right then, he said. The 2 of us are in business. And it's time for payback. Let's track down the boogeyman. First stop, Atlanta. Chapter 9. From the restaurant, Lee and Webb walked half a block. Lee pulled out a key fob and clicked the button. Ahead of them, chirping sounds came from a gleaming black Camaro parked in front of a hardware store. I'll drive the first half of the trip, Lee said. You drive the second. Like our ride? Almost invisible, Webb said. Nobody will notice us at all. Lee laughed. Had one of my employees rent it with his name. We're off the radar unless we get pulled over for speeding. But Roy and I have a weakness for fast cars and motorcycles. I figure if we're going on a road trip, we're going to do it in style. Lee opened the trunk. Webb saw a suitcase and a computer bag. Webb put his travel bag in, shut the trunk, and slipped into the passenger seat. Bucket seats, leather, tinted windows. It wasn't a bad ride. As Lee put on his seatbelt, Webb asked, You and Roy are good friends, right? He's a redneck and I'm a civil rights activist. Couldn't find 2 people farther apart in ideology, but we fought back to back in jungles and in elephant grass. I know he'd die for me and I'd die for him. That's where we're going to leave this reading. So join me again next time for more of Tin Soldier by Sigmund Brouwer.